Hello and welcome to the next lecture on ESL teaching methodology update. And today we'll be talking about lexical approach, methodological implications, different activities related to the lexical approach. And finally, as usual, we will try to have the critical look at this approach. We try to discuss advantages and disadvantages of this approach. I guess that you remember from your methodology of foreign language learning and teaching different techniques of teaching vocabulary of a foreign language. Today we focus not on techniques, not on a particular method, but will be something that is much broader, namely an approach. I guess that you remember the difference between an approach, method, technique and activity. Out of these four terms, an approach is the broadest term. So today we focus on an approach. That means that we are talking about some psychological approach, all right, whose intention is to teach vocabulary of a foreign language. The term lexical approach, I'll be using actually an abbreviation LA throughout my lectures. It was coined in the early 90s by Michael Lewis. And it's based on the following idea. This is actually a quotation taken from his book on the lexical approach. An important part of language acquisition is the ability to comprehend and produce lexical phrases as analyzed wholes or chunks. What does it mean? I guess that you notice that in some particular circumstances, in some particular situations or settings, we not just learn the language, vocabulary, right, specifically vocabulary, but we actually acquire the whole chunks of vocabulary. I guess that you experience something like this, especially in the naturalistic setting. When you were in Great Britain or in the States and you were talking to the native speakers of this language, I guess that you noticed that, well, the vocabulary that you acquired, it just got just like this to your head. So this is what was noticed by Michael Lewis, that when we learn or acquire the vocabulary of a foreign language, we don't have to focus on the form of this vocabulary, but more on the meaning, and especially on how this particular vocabulary functions within other vocabulary items. In this slide, you have the three very important books published by Michael Lewis, originator of the lexical approach. The first and the most important one, the most influential one, is the lexical approach, but also implementing the lexical approach and LTP dictionary of selected collocations. In my presentation, I will actually rely to a great extent on the first book, the lexical approach, and partly on the last one, implementation of the lexical approach. So what does Michael Lewis suggest? First, lexis is the basis of language. What does it mean? That means that grammar is not as important as lexis. Even phonology, phonetics is not as important as lexis. That means that if we have some wide array of vocabulary, we may communicate. And we don't have to know grammar. Lexis is misunderstood in language teaching because the assumption that grammar is the basis of the language is, as we know, dominant. So this is what he actually suggests. Forget about grammar, focus primarily on the lexis, and you will be able to convey the message across to your interlocutors. The key principle of lexical approach is that language consists of grammaticalized lexis, not lexicalized grammar. a very, very important sentence that I actually underlined. You may expect the sentence like this on your final multiple choice test. So, of course, there is grammar. We cannot say that we are communicating without grammar. But when we are learning lexes, there is some grammar that is within the lexes. All right? And this is the way that we learn. And not we are learning grammar in which there is lexes. If you find it more disputable, just take some time to digest this information. But I think that it seems logical. Now, another observation made by Michael Lewis is that one of the main principles of any meaning-centered syllabus should be lexes. So when we open up the book, any English course book, there should be no grammar as dominant components of this course book. But the syllabus should be centered around different lexical items. So to continue suggestions by Michael Lewis, have a look at another quotation. Instead of words, we consciously try to think of collocations and to present these in expressions, rather than trying to break things into even smaller pieces. There is a conscious effort to see things in larger, more holistic ways. All right? What does it mean? It means that it's better for our mind to process information, to process lexical items that are somehow combined, and not to learn some lexical items that are, in isolation. The taxonomy of lexical items that I categorize under the headings in the charts are the following. Words as the smallest linguistic components. Then we have polywords, collocations or word partnerships, institutionalized utterances, sentence frames and heads. According to Michael Lewis, we learn the language, we learn the lexis of the target language in terms of these particular aspects. Now, the task for you, before you come to the next slide, the task for you is to think about any examples of words, polywords, collocations, utterances, and sentence frames that come to your mind. So do not look at the next slide, but just try to make some effort and think about examples of all these categories. All right, and this is the work that I've done for you. So as to the words, these are examples of words. Book, pen, a pen, right? Polywords, by the way, upside down, collocations and word partnerships, community service, absolutely convinced, or some examples of institutionalized utterances. I will get it. That will do. If I were you, if I were in your shoes, would you like a cup of tea? Would you like a cup of coffee? What about? And sentence frames and heads. That is not as you think. The fact suggestion problem danger was. And there are even some text frames that we rely on when we learn the language. In the paper we explore, firstly, secondly, finally. Well, if you think about writing your MA thesis, well, definitely you rely on some sentence frames and heads. Starting this line of thinking, blah, blah, blah. In the first chapter, I would like to explore. In the second chapter, I would like to investigate, blah, blah, blah. So definitely, this is the way how we remember vocabulary. Now, let's try to have a closer look at lexical approach. And the first assumption is that in this approach, instruction focuses on relatively fixed expressions that occur frequently in spoken language, such as, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you jump, that will never happen to me, and so on and so on. So have a look, there are no very original, creative sentences, right? But these are rather fixed expressions, kind of formulas and patterns, linguistic patterns that are important in the lexical approach. It's important in the lexical approach to make some very important distinction between stock of individual words and real lexes. In some other methods of foreign language learning and teaching, we relied on stock of individual words. That means that if you think about, for instance, grammar translation method, how did you learn vocabulary in this particular method? There was a list of words in Polish and in English, right? Or in Polish and in Latin. So the main idea of learning vocabulary in the target language was to think in terms of equivalence, word by word approach, right? So if there was a word, a meeting, all right, you attach some meaning to this particular word and some equivalent of this word in your native language. A meeting means spotkanie, right? Unlike in the lexical approach, the students do not have to memorize long lists of words with that are, equivalents in their native language. But it's more just like the combination. There are single words and combination of these words that we store in our mental lexicon. So the focus in the lexical approach is on building up some mental links in your mental lexicon in order to make the learning process more meaningful. So, how would we do it in the lexical approach? Instead of putting down on the board the word a meeting, spotkanie, we would put down to put off, to cancel the meeting, to be late for a meeting, and so on and so on. So once again, we focus on different lexical combinations, phrases, collocations, and not on learning the words in isolation. Of course, within the lexical approach, we can identify very important theoretical and methodological ideas. I actually listed 8, but there are, of course, many more important methodological ideas. It seems for me that the most important is that language consists of grammaticalized lexes and not lexicalized grammar. There's actually a key sentence taken from the Lexical Approach by Michael Lewis. Number 2, time is an essentially lexical concept, right? Number 3, lexical patterns can be more powerfully generative than structural patterns. And delexicalized verbs are powerful generators. Metaphors are lexically patterned, and different pattern generating systems require different pedagogical treatment. Inadequately grammaticalized interlanguage is fully acceptable. And finally, language is inherently focused on here and now, and it's centered on its user, so on our learner. And now let's focus on different points that are significant at the stage of lexical approach implementation. Definitely we should pay more attention, especially to the fact that lexes consist of different kinds of multi-word chunks, and specific language areas that were not previously standard in many EFL texts are introduced in the lexical approach. As to listening, listening may be implemented at the lower levels, and reading definitely at the high levels. There might be some activities in the lexical approach that are based on first and second language comparison. Even translation that is found to be so, old-fashioned related to grammar translation method may be implemented in the lexical approach. We focus in the lexical approach on probable rather than possible English. And organizing student notebooks to review patterns and aid retrieval is also very important in the implementation of the lexical approach. That means that we as teachers, we should teach our learners where to find information about learning strategies, or maybe teach them directly different vocabulary memorization strategies, how to organize your notes, how to highlight vocabulary, maybe to use different colors for verbs, for adjectives, for nouns. The language that students may meet outside the classroom. So it's a real-life language, not very artificial language that is just in the course books, but it's a language that the students may find when they travel to the target language countries. And finally, preparing students to get maximum benefits from the text. In the lexical approach, the texts that are introduced these are all authentic texts. There is a great emphasis that is put on authenticity, because authenticity of the text is related to the real life language. The question that may be posed at this stage of our deliberations about the lexical approach is what methodological principles may be established for EFL teachers. What seems of primary importance is definitely the fact that early emphasis should be put on receptive skills, especially listening. In this way, we also learn the target language vocabulary. Number 2, decontextualized vocabulary learning is a fully legitimate strategy. Right? The role of grammar is treated as a receptive skill, must be of course recognized. Teachers should also employ extensive deictic language for receptive purposes. And finally, extensive writing should be delayed as long as possible. To give you some more principles that may be established for EFL teachers, let's start from recording formats. Non-linear recording formats are intrinsic to the lexical approach, and word formulation should be the natural response to student error. I guess that you remember different types of corrective feedback that might be provided to your students, but in the lexical approach, the focus is put on reformulation. And teachers should always react primarily to the content of student language. And finally, pedagogical chunking should be a frequent classroom activity. I guess that we'll do as far as, theoretical things are concerned. And right now, let's check whether you understood the main assumptions of the lexical approach. So I prepared for you different exercises to check whether you, grasp the main idea of the lexical approach. The question for you is, which of these adverbs can be sentence adverbs, commenting on the whole sentence which follows? Such activities you may expect in the lexical approach, right? So, you have amazingly, certainly, doubtfully, frankly, indefinitely, finally, hopefully, generally, incidentally, regrettably, surprisingly, and unusually. All right? Try to answer this question. And then, when you are ready, focus on 3 more questions related to the main question, namely, which of them do you use when you speak? And which of them do you know or understand, but you don't use them actually? And finally, which of them are new to you? Well, I guess that you as very proficient students of English, you actually know all these adverbs. But think about introduction of such an activity at a pre-intermediate or intermediate level for intermediate level students. So this is the main idea of an activity that is based on the lexical approach. Now, the second exercise that I prepared for you is very similar actually to the first one, but I would actually assign this particular exercise to the students at more advanced level, right? Which of these are used as qualifiers or intensifiers in front of an adjective? Of course, a student who is more advanced should be acquainted with the terms such as qualifier, intensifier, or adjective. That's obvious, all right? Students at pre-intermediate level actually know what an adjective means. And we have the list of words: amazingly, fortunately, awfully, extremely, particularly, generally, dangerously, surprisingly, really, shockingly, slightly and unusually. If you're ready with your answers, once again, ask yourself the question: which of them do you understand and use? And which of them you understand but maybe you don't use them? Which of them are new to you? And maybe which of them you don't like or you don't think you will ever use in your life? And the last exercise that I prepared for you is designed for beginners, students or pre-intermediate students. There is a list of expressions: a party, lunch, a pound, a cup of tea, time to, a hand, a cold, the opportunity to. And the question for you is, how many expressions can you make which use either part of the verb have with them or part of the verb give? All right? So you ask your students, can we say have a party and give a party, both of them or none of them? And in this way, our students learn, well, the collocations. They do not learn the words individually, in isolation, but they learn chunk of words. In exercise number 4, once again, we have the list of different words, different expressions. And the question is, which of the following can come immediately after the verb play? And you should mark each one with either P letter or X letter. P stands for possible, X for not possible. Well, this particular exercise seems to be so easy, just at first glance, but actually it might be difficult if you think about some more complex collocations. Of course, you may introduce exercises like this to your students, and you may, change vocabulary, change these expressions to adjust them to the level of your students. And another example, you may introduce some very nice chunks of vocabulary and collocations starting from a sentence. So you put down on the board a sentence: we say on television. And now the question is, how many other words can you think of which are similar to television and go in the sentence? It's on television, it's on the radio, it's on the news, and so on, right? Well, you may even prepare a kind of competition activity for your learners to encourage them to, to work in groups. And the last exercise that I prepared for you is related to discourse analysis. It was actually suggested by McCarthy, who noticed that agreement and disagreement are more frequently expressed in speech through lexical rather than grammatical devices. What does it mean? It means that if we want to express our agreement or disagreement, we more rely on the selection of some specific vocabulary and not so much on grammar. So tenses are not so important as the choice of good vocabulary. And here suggested lexical exercises of the following type. So have a look at the next slide. Well, try to do this exercise on your own. For instance, you've got a sentence. He was very strange. Try to agree, but using a synonym. Or agree with an antonym. Joe did not stick to the subject. Now, agree with a more general word. The cat is great company. Or maybe agree with a more specific word. Books are badly printed nowadays. Do not look at the next slide and try to do it on your own. And these are the answers. He was very strange. Yes, very odd. Okay, so the learners provided the teacher with their synonym to a strange. And they also agreed using an antonym. If Joe did not stick to the subject, the learners produce an agreement saying he wandered off too much. As to agreement with a more general word, the cat is great company, where all pets are. And finally, agree with a more specific word. Books are badly printed nowadays, especially paperbacks. So this is how you may actually design an exercise that is devoted just to agreement. But the same actually procedure may be implemented for disagreement, for expressing different feelings and different functions of the language. And now let's focus on the critical evaluation of the lexical approach. Let's start from the positive points. Extensive writing is delayed. Definitely it's a positive point. Writing is the most difficult of all the skills to be mastered, especially in the English language, where there is, as you know, such a great discrepancy between the graphic representation and the pronunciation of vocabulary, of words. So definitely it's something positive. Writing should be actually introduced as the last skill and not the first one. And what happens in the majority of classrooms? Well, we know it, right? The first lesson, how are you, what's your name? And all the learners are forced from the very beginning to speak and to write at the same time. But according to the lexical approach, we should start from, as you remember, from listening. So emphasis is on listening. Learning vocabulary is in context. There is nothing to argue about. Definitely it does make sense, right? That if we learn vocabulary in the context, it's more memorizable. And finally, focus on communication. So we do not just learn vocabulary that is, artificial, not used in everyday language, but we learn the vocabulary that is used regularly. But of course, there are also some negative points. Grammar is not taken into consideration. All right. That means that grammar is not even it's not that the grammar is not priority, but grammar, I would say, is somehow neglected. And no suggestion is given by Michael Lewis how to organize a lesson or a course. If you think about pyramid lesson plan or task-based approach, we had some, fixed guidelines how to conduct a lesson. And what about lexical approach? Nobody knows how to do it, right? And the last point is there is a lot of memorizing. Memorization definitely works perfectly well for some specific group of students. These students who are very analytical thinkers, analytical learners, memorization definitely is something that might be motivating and might appeal to this category of learners. But for, I would say, the majority of learners, memorization is associated with some boring process and something that may actually demotivate us. Of course, you may find lots of other, negative and positive points. Try to think about positive and negative points. This is your homework.